Hello everybody and welcome back to another My Porch Prints tutorials. This is Kyra and today we are going to be working on a new series called the 3 Ways series, and today we are going to do scraps. So this is how to use scraps in 3 different ways. And for today's project, you can see on screen there are a lot of different kits, but these are just because these are all of the scraps I had from various kits. So if you were interested, this is to help you find them. However, you can use whatever scraps you have lying around. It doesn't have to be these exact ones. So to begin, we are going to start by making a scrap collage sheet. And a collage sheet is just a bunch of different scraps that you have layered on top of each other that you can later sort of tear apart and use to decorate your journal or create like bookmarks or tags, things like that. So for this one, I am using just a regular 8.5 by 11 sheet of cardstock, and I'm going to be decorating it with these papers, starting with this sort of shabby rose one, just gluing it down in the corner and smoothing everything out. And then grabbing one of the shabby blue papers, or maybe these are the blue French papers. I had it listed at the beginning, it'll also be down in the description, but just tearing some pieces from these and gluing them down to cover any of the white that is showing. And don't worry if there are leftover scraps from this project, we can go ahead and use these scraps in our later projects we'll be working on. So set them aside for now, don't throw them away. And I kind of went ahead and did almost like this little wave pattern with these papers, sort of sandwiching in the top and bottom of the sheet with the lighter blue. And then I went ahead and laid out all of my scraps how I wanted them again, just to make sure they would fit on the page. And they do, so I'm going to be carefully sort of setting them aside in little clusters so that I don't forget the sort of decorative pattern I'm going to be going with. And to begin, I went ahead and glued down some lace doilies in the background, just kind of adding to the layered texture. And then for decorating, I mean, you can use whatever you'd like, but I tried to stick with a color scheme. So I was sort of sticking with blues and off-whites and golds, just kind of make it look a little more cohesive. And then as far as like a pattern of laying things out, I tried to sort of keep them in clusters, like since the whole purpose of this is sort of to have pieces that you can tear out and use. So keeping things kind of close together in organized clusters that I'm kind of doing like sort of like a layered ladder pattern, if that makes sense. If you've noticed, like in the top left corner, I sort of have it lead down into the center of the page by layering papers one on top of the other in almost like a step pattern. And I do that again with most of these, like the bottom right corner that I'm working on right now. You can see very clearly I started with like the longest and widest piece and just went smaller and smaller down into the corner. And this just kind of keeps the layers looking organized, if that makes sense. It's an organized mess, organized chaos. That's kind of all of junk journaling, isn't it? And you can go ahead and get more decorative if you like by going around the edges of things with distress ink, just to kind of make them pop out a little bit so all the pieces don't look perfectly clean and fresh. Or you can use torn pieces like I have, just whatever scraps you have lying around, but it's okay to decorate them a little bit to give them a little more character if you want. And another thing to remember is to use smaller pieces since you are going to be tearing these out. For example, I had a large like rabbit piece, but I didn't want to accidentally like tear the rabbit apart. So I tried to use small pieces that you can kind of tear around without like destroying any piece that would look kind of weird. And to finish it off, I'm just adding a couple of little buttons and bows, just gluing down embellishments, adding a little bit of washi tape, a little bit of cloth you might recognize from our Jane Austen cover, and just gluing everything down. And there you have it. That is your collage sheet finished. Putting those scraps to good use. As you can see, it's not too hard to take some scraps and make something beautiful with them. So never throw anything away. You can always repurpose things. So I hope that you will give this collage sheet a try. All right, moving on to our next scrap project. We are going to be making some little like scrap mini books. And for that, I went ahead and grabbed some different ribbons that I had. I tried to use ones that were wide, like 2.5 inches, 3 inches wide. And for that, I just sort of cut them into a general book shape, I suppose. Like you could make yours a little thinner or wider, however you'd like. This is just kind of what I did. So I went about almost 5.5 inches long pieces. They're about 2 inches wide, 2.5. And I used 2 that had wire in them and 1 that was just fabric. And I also grabbed some scraps that I tried again to stick with a color theme. So one of them is all yellow to kind of match the daisy. The other one is more different shades of pink. And the last one are like shades of blues and pinks. Just kind of trying to find things that go together. And because most of these are scrap pieces, they weren't printed front and back. You can always run yours through a printer and print on the back if you'd like, but I just decided to go ahead and fold mine in half and glue them down so that there wouldn't be any white showing. And then carefully I went and tore strips of paper, tearing along all of the edges until they were roughly the same size as my book cover and fit in it nicely like so. And I just went ahead and did that for all of the pages. I used decorative pages as well as some lined scrap pages, so you could use these if you wanted to like write in them or decorate them. And once I had sort of a good bundle for a single signature, I just sort of checked and made sure everything was lined up in the book, like so. And then taking my sewing machine, I'm just going to open up to the center, keeping everything sort of aligned if you can. You could clip it down if you wanted to. And then I'm using a very tight zigzag kind of stitch. I don't know anything about sewing, so I'm not sure if this stitch actually has a name or not. If anyone knows, please feel free to comment down below. But because the stitch was so tight, I was able to kind of use it to make the spine by just kind of folding around the stitch, and it just automatically formed a spine, which I wasn't expecting, but it was very nice. Just like that. Makes it look a little more like a book. And there you go. That is what that looks like. Again, be careful when sewing not to go over it too many times if you're going back and forth to hold the stitch in, because this is paper, so it can tear if you rough it up too many times, so just be careful of that. And that is what it should look like when it is done. For a first attempt, I've never done this before. I think it actually turned out really good. I was sort of just, with all of these scrap projects, kind of just making things up as I go and trying new ideas, and I really like how this one turned out, so I'm pretty happy with it. And for this project, I decided to try a little bit of distress ink on the second book that I made, and I did really like the way that these pages turned out, so that is something to try if you like the look of your little mini book being a little more distressed. And for the blue book, I used the sort of fabric piece of ribbon that didn't have any wire in it, and I will say that I do prefer the wired ones because they give a little more structure, so that's just something to keep in mind. And then for closing the books or decorating them, I added like a bow to this one, as well as a bulb pin with a charm on it, just to kind of keep things interesting. So this is what that book looked like when it was finished. And I just left mine blank. I didn't decorate them or anything. That's not really part of this video, but feel free to do that if you'd like. I did go ahead and add some ribbon to this second one by cutting a hole in the front and back cover and then just tying a little bow. Just to sort of help keep the pages closed together since they didn't have that wire structure. Like so. And it's fairly easy to just untie and open. And this one I did a mix of distressed edges, like with the distress ink, and just plain. And I kind of think it added to like the scrappiness of the book. I liked it. So there you go. There are the scrap mini books finished. Alright, for this last project, we are going to be gathering all of our scraps from the previous projects as well as some new ones. There are some cardstock scraps in here, but we're not going to be using those for this project. I was sort of experimenting. We're going to be putting together a scrap ribbon, and for other scrap ribbons I've seen, everybody uses fabric for the actual ribbon, but I wanted to try getting rid of some paper scraps, so I decided to make my entire ribbon out of paper. So for that, I'm just tearing off some strips, trying to kind of keep them all at a medium length when possible, and then just going ahead and sorting them by color and style so that I don't use the same ones too many times, but they don't have to be the same size. They can be shorter or longer scraps. I did tear around all of the edges, so that took a little bit of time, so just be patient while working on this. And then to begin, I went ahead and grabbed different scraps, making sure that I wasn't using the same one twice, and just kind of layering them one after the other and sewing them together just like this. And for this, I went ahead and just sewed straight down the middle of the ribbon and just kept going, and that kept the process sort of smooth and fast. I actually found this to be a really relaxing process. I probably could have kept going forever if I wanted to. It was just, I don't know, sort of meditative. So to do that, I'm just sort of sewing down the middle, and then as soon as I get close to the end, feeding a new scrap into the line of ribbon that we are making, and then just continuing to sew. Again, being careful of your fingers here. And I tried to line up the ends so that they were sort of similar in size. So if I tore a scrap that was a bit thinner towards the end, I tried to match it up with another scrap that was thin, just so that the ribbon looked a little more seamless, technically. And you don't have to sew it this way. I just did because it was faster and more convenient for the project that I was working on. And this is what it looks like as you go along. However, if you wanted to, you could do what I did at the beginning and sort of try to sew them horizontally so it's not going through the whole piece, but that will take a little more time since you have to cut the string every time you start a new piece of scrap onto the ribbon. But here is what it looks like when it's all finished before we decorate it. And you could just leave them plain if you wanted to. You don't have to decorate them. They're kind of nice just to have, like, if you're trying to find a way to organize your scraps, this is one way to do it. Just sew them all together and then wind them up in sort of a ribbon roll. And I wasn't sure if the paper would wind quite the same as cloth ribbon, but it actually worked perfectly fine, so I was really pleased with that. Just like so. And it's kind of just pretty on its own. You could always take these and tear pieces off to use as like scrap pieces for like labels that you're making, or covers, or like decorating for pockets, things like that. You could kind of tear a whole strip off and use it to line an entire page. There's lots of ways you could use it as is. But we're going to go ahead and decorate it. So I'm going to use some pins and just sort of clip it closed for now. And digging into my ephemera storage, my extra scrap ephemera pieces. If you're like me, you don't usually use every piece of ephemera from every kit. So I usually put them aside and save them for a rainy day. And that is today. So I'm going to be using really small pieces of ephemera. If you have a wider strip of ribbon, like if you tear wider strips, you can use larger pieces. But since mine is fairly small, I'm going to be using these smaller pieces of ephemera, as well as grabbing some like ribbon scraps from my ribbon scrap jar. And again, making sure that they are cut small enough to actually fit onto the ribbon strip that we are using. And also adding, you can use buttons or scraps or bows, anything that you want to decorate it with. So to begin, I'm going to be using Fabri-Tac glue, and I'm going to be sticking to sort of a formula here of using a small ribbon scrap or like a wider piece of flat ephemera, like a letter or a ticket, and then adding a smaller piece of ephemera on top of that in the center. And that's pretty much the formula I used for the whole ribbon. I did have a few where I used maybe one or two pieces of ephemera, or I did sort of like a layered stack, sort of that we talked about earlier, where they kind of stagger up the ribbon. And you'll see what I'm talking about here in a little bit. But for the most part, if you want to keep it simple, just glue a piece of ephemera down on top of a scrap of ribbon and you've basically got the formula. I left a little bit of space between every single one so that you could see the decorative papers in the background. And also it will make it easier to cut pieces out to use to glue down onto your journal or decorate a pocket or a card. You could also cut these in longer strips and make like a decorative bookmark, or again, glue them down to the edge of a page to just give it a decorative edge. There's lots of different ways you could use this. It's just really kind of a fun, cute process. A nice way to use all of those little scraps that you might have laying around in a box somewhere. So yeah, you could also stick to like a color scheme. Like here I'm using a bunch of different purple ones. It's really whatever your heart tells you to do. All right, so this is what that scrap ribbon looks like when it's finished. Just like so. And I only decorated a little bit of my ribbon because, one, for time constraint reasons, and also because when winding it up, the ribbon will get a little bit bigger because of the scraps and the way that they bend and fold. So the ribbon will be a little bit thicker. So if you decorate the whole thing, it may get a little too big for storage potentially. So I would just decorate it little by little as you go. But of course, that's up to you. All right, so that is all of the scrap projects finished. I hope that you found some inspiration, and thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye!